Watch closely, folks. Did Senator Adam Schiff, the undisputed master of Washington's political theater, ever truly comprehend that his meticulously constructed empire of influence would be completely annihilated on a random Tuesday morning by Speaker Mike Johnson, a notoriously quiet man armed with absolutely nothing but a closed black binder and the crushing, undeniable weight of the truth? As someone who has spent a lifetime navigating the ruthless, high-stakes ecosystem of American national politics, I can tell you that there are specific, grand rooms within the Capitol complex that are architecturally designed to build towering political reputations, and there are other rooms, equally grand, that are meticulously designed to bury those very same reputations forever. For 8 long, completely uninterrupted years, Adam Schiff had unequivocally been the most articulate, the most fluent, and the most dominant man in absolutely any room he chose to walk into. He was a seasoned litigator, a masterful orchestrator of public perception who knew exactly how to play the television cameras, how to effortlessly control the sweeping national narrative, and how to thoroughly exhaust his political opponents until they simply surrendered to his framing of the fact. He walked into the cavernous committee room in the Longworth building on that bitterly cold Tuesday morning with the distinct, undeniable posture of a man who firmly believed he had already won the day before the first gavel had even struck. Why wouldn't he? He had dominated this exact room, under these exact conditions, more times than he could possibly count. The press gallery was packed to the absolute brim, with seasoned journalists sitting shoulder to shoulder, their laptops glowing brightly in the dim light, their breaking news stories already half-written in their heads, waiting only for Schiff to deliver his signature, perfectly polished sound bites. Outside, dedicated political activists had lined up in the freezing pre-dawn cold just to secure a seat, eagerly anticipating the spectacle of watching a conservative speaker get systematically taken apart by a master orator. Across the heavy mahogany table from him sat Speaker Mike Johnson, a remarkably quiet man who had positioned a completely closed black binder squarely in front of him, his hands resting gently on top of it. Johnson had not raised his voice a single time all morning. Nor was he smiling or frowning. He simply wore the unreadable, patient face of a seasoned attorney who had waited through far longer, far more tedious opening statements in actual courtrooms where the fundamental stakes mattered far more than political posturing. Hidden within the mundane, carefully tabbed pages of that black binder were the highly classified details of 2 separate residential properties, and the devastating, unassailable fact that Adam Schiff had sworn under the strict penalty of perjury that each one was his exclusive primary residence. But the catastrophic revelation of that fatal, career-ending contradiction was yet to come. First, the audience had to endure the sermon. Schiff, sensing the eager anticipation of the cameras, leaned aggressively into his microphone. He flashed the practiced, calculating smile he specifically reserved for prime-time broadcasts. A smile that conveyed total superiority. He went on the offensive immediately, attempting to aggressively paint Johnson not as a serious constitutional scholar or a respected legislative leader, but as a small-town Louisiana television evangelist who merely happened to hold a law license. Schiff mocked Johnson's extensive legal career fighting to force prayer back into public schools, derisively framing him as a man who worked for fringe organizations that the courts had supposedly slapped down a dozen times over. It was the classic, heavily practiced pivot of a veteran Washington insider who profoundly understood the dark arts of distraction. If you viciously and publicly attack the character, the religion, and the underlying motives of the man holding the investigative file, the media will focus on the conflict, and absolutely nobody will ever bother to look at the actual evidentiary contents of the file itself. Schiff played brilliantly to the partisan activists filling the room, drawing loud, appreciative laughter from the rows of his dedicated supporters seated behind him. He let the laughter breathe, letting the moment hang in the air to establish his dominance, before leaning back into the microphone to deliver his prepared crescendo. He demanded dramatically to know why, a man he purposefully labeled as being kept on a tight leash by dangerous Christian nationalists, people who allegedly believed a nation of 300 million should be run out of a single church in Shreveport, was allowed anywhere near the deeply guarded, highly classified secrets of the United States of America. Schiff executed a practiced quarter turn toward the television cameras, wanting absolutely everyone watching across the nation to know that he was, without question, the smartest, most untouchable man in the room. And he wanted them to know that he knew it. He was burying a sharper man, or so he thought. But as anyone who has spent enough time navigating the treacherous, marble-lined halls of the nation's capital implicitly knows, the politician who feels a desperate, overwhelming need to loudly prove he is in total control of a situation is rarely the one actually holding the reins. Speaker Mike Johnson did not answer the aggressive provocation immediately. He let the echoes of Schiff's grandstanding fade into the high ceilings of room 110, sitting perfectly still at the center of the dais, refusing to take the bait and refusing to match Schiff's manufactured outrage. When Johnson finally chose to speak, his voice was so measured, so incredibly calm and quiet, that the entire noisy room had to physically lean forward just to catch his words. He politely acknowledged Schiff's self-righteous demand for total honesty over the last 4 minutes, and then, with deliberate, terrifying slowness, he opened the black binder to the very first tab. He did not wave the document dramatically for the cameras like a political prop. Instead, he simply began to read the senator's own historical words back to him with the flat cadence of a court reporter. Johnson transported the newly silent room back to the 20th of March, 2017, reminding the senator of the specific, highly publicized day he had stood confidently at a microphone and told the American public that the evidence of political collusion between the president and a foreign power was, in his exact, heavily broadcasted words, not hidden, not classified, but actively sitting in plain sight. Johnson looked up from the binder and asked a remarkably simple, devastatingly direct question. He asked Schiff if he remembered saying that, and Schiff, his previously triumphant smile tightening slightly as he rapidly recalculated the shifting political geometry of the moment, answered that he remembered being right about a great deal that the legislative body refused to see. Johnson's voice did not rise, but it noticeably narrowed, cutting through the evasion. He demanded a simple binary answer. Did Schiff tell the country the evidence was in plain sight, yes or no? Schiff, cornered by his own televised history, answered yes, arrogantly, stating that he stood by every word. Johnson meticulously turned the heavy page of the binder and calmly promised that before this committee hearing concluded, he was going to systematically show the entire room and the entire watching country absolutely everything that was truly in plain sight. He listed the coming attractions: the controversial surveillance Schiff had blessed, the historic censure vote his own house took against him, and a highly damning piece of paper near the very end of the binder where Schiff had sworn under oath that 2 completely different houses in 2 completely different states were each the exclusive, only home he possessed. Johnson let the immense gravity of that accusation sit in the freezing air of the room. He reminded Schiff that for 8 long years, the senator had built a lucrative, highly visible career calling other prominent men frauds and liars. Now, Johnson declared with chilling calmness, he had brought the file on Schiff, and they were going to open it up and read it together for the very first time. At that precise, undeniable moment, the underlying atmosphere in the grand room fundamentally shifted, snapping like a dry twig in a silent forest. The partisan laughter abruptly evaporated, and the activists who had waited in the cold shifted uncomfortably in their wooden seats, the triumphant smiles dropping from their faces. The seasoned, cynical reporters instantly stopped typing their pre-planned stories and started watching the room intently instead. Political journalists can physically feel a story turn underneath them the exact way an experienced sailor feels. The wind fundamentally changed direction on the open ocean, and this massive story had just violently turned. Schiff's smile was still plastered on his face, but it had simply stopped meaning anything. It was now just a frozen grimace. Johnson did not rush his prosecution. He was building an unassailable evidentiary fortress, laying his palm completely flat on the open tab, mimicking the precise, authoritative gesture a seasoned litigator uses when marking a crucial exhibit he fully intends to return to. He began with the chilling, dystopian reality of the federal government's surveillance capabilities, forcefully directing the room's attention to the deeply disturbing case of a private American citizen named Carter Page. As an astute observer of power dynamics, I know intimately how easily the vast, unchecked machinery of the intelligence state can entirely crush an ordinary, unsuspecting person, and Speaker Johnson laid this terrifying dynamic bare for the cameras. He explicitly noted that Carter Page was not a man that half the partisan audience in that room would shed a tear over. Page had worked for the opposing campaign and had talked to Russians, which made him an incredibly easy, vulnerable target. Johnson accused Schiff of understanding better than anyone else in Washington exactly how to take a deeply unpopular, easy man and ruthlessly make an example out of him for political gain. Johnson did not look at his notes during this delivery. He had been a practicing litigator for nearly 20 years before he ever ran for public office, and the most vital lesson he had absorbed was that the attorney who constantly needs to check his notes has already lost the emotional connection with the jury. In plain English, carefully formulated for the working folks listening in their kitchens at home, Johnson recounted how, in 2016, the single most powerful, intrusive surveillance apparatus on the face of the earth was aggressively deployed against a private American citizen who was not a convicted spy nor charged with any crime. 4 separate, distinct times, a highly secretive federal court signed off on watching this man's every single move. Johnson paused perfectly, allowing the only sound in room 110 to be the tiny, nervous click of Adam Schiff's fountain pen cap. He then reminded the suddenly breathless room of the Department of Justice Inspector General's exhaustive, independent report. The Inspector General had gone back and read those highly classified warrant applications word for agonizing word. Johnson dropped the ultimate number heavily into the silence like a lead weight. 17. 17 documented, undeniable errors and glaring omissions embedded deep within those surveillance applications. 17 specific times the secret judicial court was actively told something completely untrue or was deliberately kept in the dark from seeing something it desperately needed to know by the very federal agencies tasked with protecting the public trust. Johnson noted that the presiding federal judge of that secretive court later wrote, in her own words, that the Bureau had actively misled the court about an American who, at the end of the day, was never charged with a single criminal offense. Johnson masterfully paced his delivery, slowing his cadence down significantly for the ordinary citizens watching on screens at home, asking them to deeply and personally imagine the sheer, unadulterated terror of that scenario. He asked them to picture the federal government arbitrarily deciding to intercept their private phone calls, meticulously read their personal mail, relentlessly track where they go and who they meet, doing it 4 times over on a warrant built entirely on falsehoods. At the end of that nightmare, there was absolutely nothing, no charge, no crime, just a citizen with his entire life violently turned inside out simply because his name was highly convenient for a powerful political narrative at a highly convenient moment in time. Yet, in the face of this monumental, historic abuse of secret government power, Schiff had publicly and repeatedly defended the corrupted process. That horrific abuse of power happened on Schiff's watch, a man whose specific constitutional job was to act as a check against exactly this kind of overreach against an ordinary citizen. Instead of stopping the abuse, Schiff had authored and officially released a political memo aggressively assuring the entire American nation that the deeply flawed surveillance was entirely clean, proper, and justified. Furthermore, Johnson drew out another page, bringing up the infamous, deeply flawed Steele dossier. He reminded everyone present that this document, which Schiff had excitedly waved at the television cameras for 3 straight years, was absolutely nothing more than an unverified pile of explosive claims. It was opposition research, painstakingly put together by a foreign operative and covertly paid for through a complex, obfuscating chain of elite lawyers by the campaign of his candidate's primary political opponent. It was bought and paid for opposition research the very day it was written, and it remained precisely that after Special Counsel Mueller concluded, after Special Counsel Durham concluded, and after everyone else had examined it. Yet, Schiff deliberately chose not to tell the trusting country that it was biased opposition research. He deliberately hid who financially sponsored it, instead standing authoritatively at a microphone and dramatically reading its salacious contents into the permanent, historical record of the United States Congress, as if an impeccable eyewitness had sworn to its absolute veracity under the threat of perjury. Schiff, feeling the walls of the narrative rapidly closing in, indignantly tried to deflect the blame, his voice growing sharp once again. He angrily argued that he did not personally run the FBI and did not author the flawed warrant applications, accusing Johnson of desperately trying to hang a massive federal agency's administrative mistakes around the neck of a senator who didn't actually make them. But Johnson, calm and relentless, masterfully closed the rhetorical trap. He told Schiff directly that he wasn't hanging the FBI's errors around his neck. He was hanging Schiff's own exculpatory memo firmly around his neck. Schiff had seen exactly what was in those deeply flawed applications. He had personally read them, and then he had willingly walked out in front of 300 million Americans and falsely declared the entire operation to be exceptionally clean. The Federal Bureau may have made the catastrophic, unconstitutional errors, Johnson noted, but it was Adam Schiff who had enthusiastically and successfully sold those catastrophic errors to the American public. It wasn't the FBI's name on the public reassurance. It was Adam Schiff's. The intense, suffocating confrontation then smoothly transitioned to the prolonged, agonizing federal investigations that had paralyzed the nation's political discourse and divided families for years. Johnson meticulously pointed out that Special Counsel Robert Mueller, armed with limitless resources, had spent 2 full years relentlessly searching for the very treasonous conspiracy that Schiff had sworn was already resting in plain sight. Yet Mueller found absolutely no criminal conspiracy, and then John Durham spent 4 additional years exhaustively investigating the murky origins of the probe, only to also come back completely empty-handed. 2 highly resourced, powerful prosecutors examining the issue from completely opposite ends of the political and legal spectrum, and neither one could find the massive, world-altering conspiracy that Schiff had confidently sworn he had already seen with his own 2 eyes. Schiff, desperately trying to regain his legendary footing in a room that was actively slipping away from him, found his feet and leaned in aggressively. His powerful, broadcast-quality voice returned full and certain as he defensively argued that Mueller had indeed documented numerous suspicious contacts between the campaign and Russian agents. He claimed he had never once alleged a strict criminal conspiracy in a court of law. He merely stated that the conduct was deeply unpatriotic, that the country absolutely deserved to know about it, and that history would validate his righteous demands to uncover the truth, even if Johnson sneered at it. A low murmur of approval ran through the Democratic side of the gallery, a desperate gasp of life from supporters hoping their champion was mounting a comeback. For one held breath, the room remembered that this was a man who had famously walked into hostile rooms explicitly built to bury him, and consistently walked out looking bigger and more powerful than when he came in. But Mike Johnson did not rush, perfectly understanding the pacing of a fatal interrogation. When a hostile witness finally throws the heavy punch he has been loading up for minutes, a master lawyer lets that punch swing harmlessly through the empty air before countering it. Johnson quietly isolated Schiff's defensive word choice, softly noting that contacts were absolutely not the incendiary word the senator had weaponized on television for years. Schiff did not sit on Sunday morning panels and tell the terrified American public there were mere contacts worth looking into. He told them the treasonous, systemic collusion was sitting in plain sight. Johnson reminded Schiff, a former prosecutor himself, that those 2 concepts sit light years apart in the realm of law and public accusation. Johnson tapped the page of the binder, granting Schiff a fraction of a concession only to make the impending blow land harder. Schiff was half right when he said the evidence was in plain sight. He just wasn't pointing in the correct direction. Johnson heavily emphasized the profound, irreversible, heartbreaking societal damage those specific, reckless statements had caused. Setting aside all congressional courtesy, Johnson spoke of how families across the country permanently stopped speaking to each other at Thanksgiving dinner tables, and how trusting neighbors bitterly turned against neighbors for years on end, all over a phantom conspiracy that 2 special prosecutors went looking for and simply could not find. The profound silence that followed in the committee room was the distinct, incredibly uncomfortable sound of a powerful man being forced to watch his own destructive, divisive words physically march back across the table to ruthlessly condemn him. When Speaker Johnson resolutely turned the tab to the turbulent autumn of 2019, he directly addressed the explosive whistleblower complaint that had violently sparked the first presidential impeachment in 2 decades. He reminded Schiff that as the chairman running the investigation, Schiff was the prosecutor, the architect, and the ubiquitous face of the impeachment on every single television screen in America. Johnson recounted a specific, highly critical moment on national television where the senator was asked a plain, unambiguous question. Had his committee, his staff, or anyone working for him had any prior contact with the whistleblower before that formal complaint miraculously arrived at their doorstep? Schiff had looked directly into the camera and confidently said no. Johnson, stripping away the last remaining vestiges of polite congressional courtesy from his normally mild voice, stated plainly that this denial was simply demonstrably not true. Schiff's staff had absolutely been in extensive contact with the individual before the complaint was officially filed. Schiff knew the man who knew first, and yet he voluntarily told the entire country a needless, bald-faced lie. He wasn't under physical torture. He wasn't lying to save a child's life. He told a lie on a random Tuesday about a procedural detail that would have likely been forgotten by Friday, simply because he arrogantly decided that the truth was whatever best served his immediate political narrative in those 90 seconds of prime-time airtime. Johnson set both hands completely flat on the black binder and demanded the room understand exactly what that specific lie touched. That complaint directly birthed an impeachment proceeding, and Johnson highlighted the immense, earth-shattering gravity of an impeachment, describing it as the absolute most solemn, monumental, and destructive instrument the House of Representatives possesses to wield against a sitting president. It is a process that fundamentally must be universally viewed as beyond reproach, a process that nobody can legitimately call rigged, because the historical stakes are simply too catastrophically high for anything less than impeccably clean hands. And yet, Johnson condemned Schiff for acting as the primary prosecutor of this grave constitutional process, while knowingly standing on a foundational fact that he had directly lied to the television cameras about. He took the most solemn instrument in the American Republic and deliberately tainted its very origins with a calculated deception. For the first time all morning, the litigator's icy calm cracked open into something genuinely hot and righteous. Johnson accused Schiff of operating on a dedicated pattern, asserting that Schiff wasn't merely careless, he wasn't simply confused by the rapid pace of events. Every single time, Schiff consciously decided that his preferred political story was worth far more than the objective fact. He did it to a private citizen like Carter Page, he did it to a highly secretive federal court, and he did it to every single working man and woman who tuned into their evening news and completely believed the serious, articulate fellow in the dark, expensive suit. They believed him because surely a man that incredibly calm, a man that incredibly precise, a man who almost never raised his voice in anger, surely that man wouldn't just invent massive, world-altering conspiracies out of thin air. But Schiff had worn that costume of serious, institutional authority, knowing exactly the unearned trust it purchased him from the American people. When Johnson subsequently brought up the unprecedented, historic bipartisan censure that Schiff had faced in June of 2023, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. He reminded the room that the House of Representatives had done something it has done to only a tiny handful of members in over 100 years. It formally censured him by a vote of 213 to 209, forcing him to stand humiliated in the well of the chamber while the formal reprimand was read directly to his face. The institution he had served for 2 decades put its official name to one devastating finding, that Adam Schiff had purposefully misled the American people. At this point, Adam Schiff instinctively threw his hardest, most desperate punch of the morning. He turned his body fully to the cameras, finding them by pure, ingrained political instinct, and let his famous, booming voice completely fill the room, loudly dismissing the historic censure vote as nothing more than a cheap, party-line stunt that every honest person in the room knew was entirely illegitimate. He vehemently pointed out that it was 213 Republicans and 0 Democrats complaining that there was no trial, no hard evidence, just a petty, vindictive punishment for being highly effective against a man the Republican Party had spent a decade shielding from accountability. Sweeping his hand dismissively at Johnson's black binder and the entire room, Schiff declared that the real question the public should be asking is why a sitting Speaker of the House is acting as the personal revenge operative for a president who has wanted Schiff destroyed for years. He loudly proclaimed his innocence, stating he had not been formally charged with a single crime because there was absolutely nothing there, labeling the entire hearing a partisan hit job. For a fleeting, dangerous moment, the seasoned, dominant politician in Schiff completely reappeared, and his counterattack more than landed. It resonated deeply as the Democratic side of the gallery suddenly came fiercely alive, hands starting to clap in enthusiastic support before catching themselves. A journalist who had been packing up her gear immediately sat back down, realizing the fight wasn't over. One of the younger congressional members on the panel found himself unconsciously nodding in agreement before catching himself. For a long, incredibly dangerous moment, The emotional gravity of the room tilted precariously under Johnson, the exact way a courtroom fundamentally tilts when a charismatic defense attorney suddenly lands the one emotional argument the jury has been quietly desperate to hear. You could physically feel the morning starting to slide rapidly back toward the man who had won a dozen mornings exactly like it. Someone in the press corps muttered that Schiff wasn't wrong about the vote being purely partisan. For about 15 terrifying seconds, the most hated man in that room was also, somehow, incredibly, the absolute most convincing one in it. But Mike Johnson did not panic, nor did he fight the sudden tilt of the room. He had learned a very long time ago in brutal Louisiana courtrooms that the lawyer who visibly panics when the room suddenly turns against him is the lawyer who loses the case for good. So, he simply sat there and waited patiently until the supportive clapping had absolutely nowhere left to go, until the heavy, expectant silence descended once again over the crowd, and only then did he calmly open a thin, separate folder and lay 3 distinct sheets of paper on the table, placing them one at a time, exactly like a master gambler dealing cards he already knows are absolutely unbeatable. Addressing Schiff's desperate claim of a partisan witch hunt, Johnson completely dismantled the defense by naming 3 distinct, highly powerful figures who had utterly contradicted Schiff's carefully spun narratives. The first was Michael Horowitz, the career inspector general who was originally appointed by a Democrat and kept on by a Republican. He was the objective career man who found the 17 massive errors, not some partisan operative. The second was the presiding federal judge of the surveillance court, a highly respected jurist sworn to uphold the law, not a political party, who explicitly wrote that the FBI had actively misled her court. The third was special counsel John Durham, a man structurally and legally built to be entirely independent, who hunted for Schiff's promised collusion for 4 years and came back completely empty. Johnson squared the 3 sheets into a neat little stack, deliberately mirroring the exact, precise gesture Schiff had been nervously making with his own single piece of paper all morning, a subtle psychological dominance display that no one in the tense room missed. Johnson bluntly told the senator that he desperately wanted this to be a fight against Republicans because playing the victim of partisan warfare was the only fight Schiff had ever known how to win. But, Johnson noted with devastating clarity, an inspector general is not a Republican, a federal judge is not a Republican, and the objective truth doesn't carry a party card at all. That is the incredibly inconvenient thing about the truth. It just sits quietly in a file cabinet, being completely true, patiently waiting for somebody brave enough to finally read it out loud to the world. The tilt of the room immediately snapped back to level, and the clapping never resumed. Schiff helplessly tried to find the conversational thread again, weakly interjecting that the Inspector General also found the investigation was properly predicated, desperately clinging to the first half of a complicated truth. But Johnson merely nodded slowly, brutally reminding him that the very same report found it riddled with 17 catastrophic errors. Johnson laid bare Schiff's entire career strategy, taking half a true thing, saying it with an incredibly straight, serious face in front of a camera, because a half-truth was always worth vastly more to his political ambitions than the complicated whole truth ever was. Schiff did not answer, and a muscle twitched violently in his jaw. Johnson then relentlessly subjected Schiff to a rapid-fire, brutal cross-examination, using the exact same rhythmic, short-stroke questioning technique Schiff himself had brutally deployed on 100 terrified witnesses over the years. Johnson demanded yes or no answers regarding releasing the clean memo, the IG finding 17 errors, telling the country the collusion was in plain sight, and Mueller finding no conspiracy. 4 rapid-fire, inescapable questions resulted in 4 agonizing, forced yes answers from Schiff. Johnson suddenly stopped, and the heavy silence of his stopping was vastly worse than any grand speech he could have delivered. He pointed out to the entire room that he hadn't put a single word into Schiff's mouth. The entire country had just listened to a man answer yes 4 times to a series of undeniable questions that completely and totally buried his own lifelong political arguments. The ranking Democrat on the panel, who had spent the entire morning sitting with her arms fiercely folded in a mask of careful neutrality, quietly reached forward and slid her microphone an inch away from herself. She refused to look at Schiff, signaling the devastating evaporation of his institutional support. Then came the absolute fatal blow, the devastating, inescapable climax of the hearing that will undoubtedly be analyzed in political science classes and legal seminars for decades to come. Johnson, with the flat, terrible, unrelenting patience of a judge reading a final, unappealable verdict, smoothly slid one specific page out of the black binder and laid it totally flat on the table. He revealed a highly damaging May 2025 referral directly from the Federal Housing Agency, addressed straight to the Justice Department. The sole subject of the referral was Adam Schiff himself. The core, devastating allegation was a sustained, meticulously documented pattern of occupancy, misrepresentation, financial fraud, spanning across 5 completely separate financial loans from the year 2003 all the way through 2019, and as Johnson read the findings of Fannie Mae's Financial Crimes Division, something fundamental visibly went out of Schiff's usually rigid posture. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse. It was the slow, agonizing surrender of a structure's shape, exactly the way a large tent slowly sags and collapses when a critical, load-bearing pole is suddenly pulled away, Johnson signaled, and 2 highly detailed, official government documents were brilliantly projected side by side on the massive digital screens in the room, blown up large enough for even the reporters in the very back row to read clearly. One document was an official mortgage filing for a luxurious, sprawling mansion located in Potomac, Maryland, widely known as one of the absolute wealthiest, most exclusive suburbs in the entire country. The second document was a formal homeowner's tax exemption application for a condominium located thousands of miles away in Burbank, California. On both of these official, legally binding government documents, covering the exact same, overlapping stretch of years, Adam Schiff had officially sworn under the strict legal penalty of perjury that the respective property was his primary, exclusive, everyday residence. Johnson meticulously and ruthlessly explained to the mesmerized room the underlying, undeniable financial motive for this sustained, decades-long deception. The Maryland filing explicitly secured a significantly cheaper interest rate and much kinder terms from the banks, because financial institutions heavily reward the actual home a man truly lives in, while the California exemption application fraudulently secured a highly lucrative break on property taxes, because the state government also offers financial rewards for primary residency. Schiff had systematically, intentionally, and illegally extracted financial benefits from 2 completely different state governments simultaneously by swearing to 2 mutually exclusive realities. As Johnson pointed out with razor-sharp logic, there is absolutely no version of a standard human calendar where both of those sworn statements can possibly be true at the same time. One of those signatures, sitting right there on the giant screen, was a verifiable, undeniable lie. Schiff simply got to conveniently choose which government entity he lied to on any given day, depending entirely on which one was currently handing him a better financial deal. Furthermore, Johnson emphasized that this was not a simple clerical error on one bad afternoon. It was a sustained practice across 5 separate, heavily scrutinized loans that were refinanced and refinanced again, each time bearing Schiff's fresh signature at the bottom. Johnson framed this devastating financial revelation perfectly for the countless working-class voters desperately trying to make ends meet while watching in their living room. His voice didn't rise in anger, it got significantly harder and quieter, forcing the entire room to lean in even further to hear the damning indictment. He painted a vivid, heartbreaking, highly relatable picture of an honest, hard-working citizen living just 2 streets over from Schiff's Burbank condo. That ordinary man has only one house, and he tells the absolute truth about it because the very idea of committing mortgage fraud literally never crosses his mind. He pays the higher standard interest rate that an honest man is forced to pay. He wakes up exhausted at 5:00 a.m. He struggles desperately every single month to stretch a meager paycheck across a month that is always 3 days too long, and every single April he dutifully and fearfully pays exactly what he owes to the IRS, because that is what honest, law-abiding citizens do. Johnson let the heavy, crushing reality of that working-class struggle hang in the silent air. He then noted the ultimate, sickening hypocrisy. That same honest man had spent 30 long years attentively listening to Adam Schiff on his television. He had listened to that calm, profoundly serious, incredibly articulate voice grandly lecture the entire country about profound economic fairness, about the corrupt, wealthy elite illegally gaming the tax rules, and about the absolute moral imperative of the rich paying their fair share to society. And all the while, for nearly 2 entire decades, while giving those sanctimonious speeches, Schiff was secretly, systematically executing the exact same type of elite financial fraud he was loudly warning the trusting public about. Schiff had 2 houses, and he lied under oath about both of them, simply so he could pay less into the system than the exhausted man 2 streets over. Schiff wasn't heroically fighting the corrupt elites who gamed the system. He was actually one of them. He just happened to possess a vastly better broadcast voice and a much nicer, custom-tailored suit, and he ruthlessly weaponized both of those aesthetic assets to make decent, trusting people believe in his absolute integrity while he quietly defrauded the system behind their back. Schiff, practically drowning in the sheer weight of the exposure, attempted one final, incredibly desperate, agonizingly weak defense. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be, but the argument was entirely hollow. He weakly argued that complex occupancy designations for a prominent national politician living 3,000 miles away from his home district are highly complicated judgment calls, usually made by professional accountants, implying it was all just a massive, innocent administrative misunderstanding. He claimed he had not been formally charged by the DOJ and dismissed the referral as a political appointee's revenge operation dressed up as a crime. But Johnson, never once raising his voice, calmly and surgically destroyed that final, desperate illusion. He pointed out the devastating, undeniable timeline. Schiff did not suddenly decide to list that massive Maryland mansion as a second home until the year 2020, the exact same year investigative reporters finally started asking quiet, probing questions about his dual residency. From 2003 until somebody finally looked, for 17 long years, that Maryland mansion was officially, legally his only home on paper, under the penalty of perjury. As Johnson astutely noted, an honest, simple accounting mistake absolutely does not wait 17 years in silence and then magically correct itself precisely during the exact week the National Press Corps happens to show up at your doorstep. That is not an accountant's simple judgment call. That is the frantic, desperate cleanup operation of a guilty man who suddenly realizes he has finally been caught red-handed. Then, Johnson straightened his posture, let the entire room hold incredibly still, and asked the final, unanswerable question that fundamentally and permanently broke the most articulate, powerful man in Washington, D.C., demanding that Schiff state unequivocally for the official congressional record and the watching world which of the 2 homes was in fact his legal primary residence, Maryland or California. Yes or no? Johnson made the trap crystal clear and totally inescapable. It can only be one. Schiff swore under oath it was both, and whichever state Schiff chose to validate in that exact moment, the other sworn document immediately, undeniably, and legally became a documented, prosecutable lie on its face. Which is the lie, Senator? Maryland or California? Schiff looked down at the damning paper resting on the table. He looked up at the glowing screens displaying his own contradictory, fraudulent signatures, and he looked at absolutely nothing at all. He realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that there was absolutely no answer he could possibly give that did not instantly finish his career, and he knew it. Every single soul sitting in that dead silent room knew it too. Out of pure, ingrained, desperate political reflex, Schiff instinctively attempted his famous trademark pivot. He turned his signature quarter turn squarely toward the red light of the television cameras, desperately reaching deep down into his chest for his legendary broadcast baritone to dramatically redirect the collapsing narrative back to the broader American people. But the majestic words simply died violently in his throat. The phrase, "the real question, the American people," was cut out abruptly, not interrupted by an opponent, but cut out internally like a vital power wire being violently ripped straight from a drywall. He swallowed incredibly hard, the highly sensitive microphone catching the dry, terrified, clicking sound deep in his throat. He tried once again to speak, attempting to summon the smooth, certain instrument that had confidently narrated the country's deepest political nightmares for 8 straight years, but his voice instantly thinned out into something impossibly reedy, unready, and small. It completely broke on the second word and stopped dead. His trembling hand frantically flew to his expensive fountain pen, his thumb clicking the cap in a rapid, frantic, terrified little rhythm 4 times. 5 times a frantic little sound echoing loudly in an enormous, totally silent room. His other hand dragged the single piece of paper against the table edge, squaring it over and over, unable to be made still. He desperately reached out for the glass of water resting at his elbow, but his hand was shaking so violently that the ice sharply rattled against the side of the glass, creating a thin, bright sound of sheer, unadulterated panic in the silence. He set the glass back down without taking a single sip, and the pen was abandoned on the table. His hands simply quit, the way a physical thing quits when it finally understands on a cellular level that there is absolutely nothing left to do to save itself. He opened his mouth one final time, the most fluent man in Washington, standing in front of every camera in the country with his own fraudulent signature glowing behind him, and produced absolutely no sound at all, just a breath that caught halfway and died, as the room descended into an agonizing, crushing, absolute silence. It was both a profound mercy and a terrifying cruelty. A loud heckler would have given Schiff an enemy to fight. A banging gavel would have given him procedural cover to retreat. But instead, absolutely nothing happened. 200 people sat completely frozen, scarcely breathing, letting the suffocating, heavy silence belong entirely and exclusively to the man who had spent his entire adult life brilliantly ensuring that he never, ever lost control of a room's narrative. On the Democratic side of the panel, a loyal member looked down at her own hands in shame. In the gallery, a female supporter unconsciously turned her pro-Schiff campaign button face down against her coat. The man who talked for a living had entirely lost the physical ability to finish a simple sentence. In the devastating, historic end, Speaker Johnson stood up to his full height, the absolute only time he stood during the entire grueling morning, and delivered a masterful, unforgettable closing argument. Crucially, he did not speak to the broken, silent man sitting across the table. He spoke directly past him, looking straight into the lenses of the cameras, addressing the exhausted man 2 streets over in Burbank, addressing every single American who had ever been condescendingly told to sit down, shut up, and blindly trust the serious, tailored voices on their television screens. Johnson stated that Schiff had spent 8 highly lucrative years on every screen in America relentlessly hunting a liar and a fraud, continuously and gravely warning the country that the massive fraud was sitting right out in the open. And the tragic, Shakespearean irony, Johnson declared as he lifted the heavy black binder containing all the proof, was that Schiff was actually right the entire time. The massive fraud was indeed in plain sight. Schiff was simply wrong about exactly where that fraud was sitting. The massive fraud that Adam Schiff had breathlessly chased for 8 years was, in fact, himself. He didn't need to yell it. The devastating line went out over the broadcasting wires the way the pure tone of a struck bell rings out over a quiet field. As the chairman's gavel finally came down heavily, announcing the referral of the crimes to the appropriate authorities, the grand room emptied in a quiet, completely devastating, humiliating retreat that was somehow vastly worse than chaotic shouting. Schiff's ranking Democratic ally rapidly gathered her papers and abandoned him without uttering a single word of comfort, her staff trailing behind her. One by one, members of his own party found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, staring intently at their own paperwork because there is a very particular Washington-style cowardice that looks exactly like taking careful notes. Schiff's own legal counsel put a hand on his arm, telling him to stop talking, even though the client had already completely lost the ability to speak. Seasoned reporters frantically scrambled over each other to radically rewrite their entire front-page headlines in real time. The visceral, shocking video clip of Schiff's silent, catastrophic physical and vocal collapse began to circulate globally at unprecedented speeds, moving faster than any congressional footage in history. By that very afternoon, despite a highly polished, professionally crafted press release frantically issued from his Senate office, weakly claiming political persecution and an administrative grudge, the national narrative was permanently, irreversibly lost. The carefully constructed, impenetrable facade of the solemn, truth-seeking statesman was irrevocably shattered into a million tiny pieces, destroyed not by partisan attacks, not by right-wing spin, but by the absolute, undeniable, crushing weight of his own sworn signatures. People who didn't even care about politics watched a man reach for a sentence 3 times and lose it, and they understood exactly what they were witnessing. The potent spell he had cast over the nation was forever broken. In a quiet house in another state, Carter Page watched the segment twice, then turned off his TV, sitting in a quiet vindication that never makes the evening news. Johnson, speaking softly to a reporter in the hallway late that night, summarized the entire historic destruction perfectly. A man had owned 2 homes. He had sworn under oath that each one was his only home, and absolutely everything else had simply, inevitably, and tragically followed from that one foundational lie. A deeply divided nation cannot ever be argued out of a stark, naked truth that it has vividly witnessed with its own eyes on live television. 2 homes, 2 legally binding oaths, and one undeniable, career-ending truth.